Alright, Cassandra from the Discord asked for a look at the Horus Heresy from 1988 to now by Arbitrator Ian. I think his name is that? Yeah, Arbitrator Ian. We're going to take a look at this, see what's going on with it. I'm pretty sure it's going to be a recap of all the changes, retcons, things like that have been made to the actual Horus Heresy series. Before it was a series, when it was just background lore. In any case, we're going to go ahead and hit play on this, and yeah, here we go.
So the Horus Heresy is a major part of the 40k lore nowadays, the backdrop against which the history of the Imperium and Chaos is set, and it's a setting in its own right. But as most people know, it wasn't ever in the original version of 40k. Like the Badab War, it was an addition that was then expanded over the years. In this video, I'm going to take a look at how this happened, how a box out in a single book from 1988 ended up as this. Rogue Trader, the original version of 40k, was released in 1987, and while it featured a lot of elements we'd be familiar with today, including the 10,000-year-old Emperor on his golden throne, there was one massive thing missing: chaos. Chaos in the Warhammer sense, the specific mix of Lovecraft and Moorcock, was present in the Warhammer Fantasy universe, but reportedly Rick Priestley never wanted it to become part of 40k. So while we still have the warp and warp travel, psychers and astropaths, the place of demons was taken by more generic warp entities like vampires or enslavers. This all changed in 1988 with the release of a couple of books. Chapter Approved, the first book of the Astronomicon, was released at the start of the year, and it was a companion volume to Rogue Trader, full of missions and rules.
Oh no, not that book.
Rules changes and army lists, just like all the versions of Chapter Approved since. And in an unassuming bit of box color text, we get the following. The Horus Heresy is reckoned by many to rate as the single greatest disaster ever suffered by the Imperium. The specific details of the heresy are known only to the Emperor, but its broader history is the stuff of popular legend. According to one version of the tale, Horus was once the most trusted servant of the Emperor, but in his heart there dwelt a hidden evil, and he became seduced by this evil, and came to nurture demons and other forces of destruction. Horus marched upon Earth with a third part of the hosts of the Imperium, which he had seduced to his purpose. For 7 days and 7 nights, the hosts battled until the Emperor caught Horus by the head and cast him to the Eye of Terror, and with him the third part of the hosts of the Imperium.
Basically, that's the biblical story of Satan. That's exactly what it is. That's where all that came from. It's so crazy to see one paragraph has spawned so much stuff. But yeah, this is basically the story of Satan. There you go.
There it is, the first mention of the Horus Heresy, and also of demons and how they corrupt Imperial servants. No mention of Primarchs or anything like that. Horus was just a famous general who rebelled. But this box out is expanded pretty quickly. Later in 1988 came the first of the Realm of Chaos books, Slaves to Darkness, a colossal source book on chaos in both Warhammer Fantasy and which introduced chaos to 40k. Slaves to Darkness introduces the Chaos Renegades for Warhammer 40k, and in particular the Traitor Legions, the Marines who fled into the Eye of Terror after this Horus Heresy. So appropriately, it's here that we get the first full description of what exactly it was. Imperial entanglements with chaos have a long and bloody history, dating back almost to the first founding of the Legiones Astartes. The most serious incident was the so-called Horus Heresy of the 31st millennium, now commonly assumed to be a conventional revolt. Only the Emperor and the cyber libraries of the Ordo Malleus have an accurate recollection of the heresy. So in this first version of the story, Horus is one of the greatest generals of the Imperium, so great that the Emperor decides to grant him the title of Imperial War Master. However, on his way back to Terra to receive his reward, 2 things happen. First, he falls ill on the world of Davin, and during his convalescence, he's inducted into a warrior lodge, something apparently quite common as a way of building bonds.
It's amazing how much that has spawned off of this, because these are things that I actually don't know. So this is a very interesting video for me. I didn't know when the Primarchs were first mentioned. I didn't know any of that because my interest in Warhammer started in the late 90s. But continuing on, I'm loving this video.
Bonds between Imperial forces and the local population. However, this lodge is actually a chaos cult where he's promptly possessed by a demon. Among the many forces at Horus's command are 5 Legiones Astartes chapters, and they're corrupted as the warrior lodges spread through the ranks and then into the associated Adeptus Mechanicus forces and Imperial army assets. Apparently this was undetected by the Inquisition, which I guess was around then in the Rogue Trader timeline. Secondly, the Istvan system rebelled, and the War Master was quickly diverted to secure the system, which Horus did by bioweapon bombardment of Istvan III. But while this happened, some loyalists holding out against the rot in Horus's force seized the ship Eisenstein and escaped to warn the Emperor. Battles then erupt around the galaxy.
I'm loving this because all of these things are current. Horus was wounded and taken on the moon of Davin. The ship that escaped the Isfahan betrayal was the Eisenstein. You know, I'm loving it.
As the rebellion fuels old grudges and the Emperor dispatches 7 chapters, listed as a third of the Legiones Astartes, to assault Horus's temporary base on Istvan V. But 3 are almost destroyed on landing, and the 4 follow-up chapters declare for Horus, giving Horus control of 9 chapters. Horus then moves on Earth, which at this point is held by the Custodes, the Imperial Fists, and the White Scars chapters, along with loyalist elements of the Collegia Titanica, and Horus slowly seems to be winning until the Emperor disconnected himself from the Astronomicon, a signal to the Imperial fleet that the end was coming. Leading an elite force of custodians and Imperial Fists, he teleported directly into Horus's command bunker, and in the fighting that follows, Horus is killed and the Emperor is so seriously wounded that the Golden Throne needs to be constructed to keep him alive. In the aftermath, the traitor forces are hounded into the Eye of Terror and stricken from the list of active units, where their unit numbers are assigned to other Marine chapters raised in later foundings. So a surprising amount of this is familiar. Istvan III and Istvan V, the siege of the Emperor's palace, and the fight leading to the Emperor's installation on the Golden Throne. All the key beats of the story are there, even if a lot of the mythology and setup is missing. Also, I love that small details like the warrior lodges on Davin or the flight of the Eisenstein actually predate, say, the idea of Primarchs or the Space Marine Legions. In the tradition of Warhammer backstory, even now, this feels less like a retcon and more like an incomplete history told in world. So at this point, we don't have a list of exactly which chapters for.
The one thing I like about this so far is as the story evolves, basically, if you were to look this from as an outsider coming in, most of the lore surrounding, that time period, at the time the Horus Heresy books started coming out, was still very, very, shrouded. It wasn't really, nothing was really known. The good thing about this is if you were to pick up and start reading the lore from 1988 up until, now, if you were to start, doing the backtrack and all that kind of stuff, you would get a good idea of what it's like to be an Imperial in the 41st, 42nd millennium, because Horus is a boogeyman to them. I mean, they know that Horus is literally Satan to them, in their whole mythos, and it's just interesting to see how this played out.
Or who turned traitor and who didn't, but the book gives us army lists and backgrounds for 3 traitor legions: the World Eaters, Emperor's Children, and Black Legion. And again, it's surprising how little their stories have changed. The World Eaters are, as we'd expect, bloody-handed and savage, and use psychosurgery that made them almost uncontrollable away from the battlefield. Yep, that's them. The Emperor's Children are listed as one of the relief legions deployed by the Emperor to pacify the revolt, but during a parley, their chapter master and officers were corrupted by the decadent pastimes Horus offered, and drugged until they swore loyalty to Slanesh. Finally, the Black Legion are listed, and their story about being called the Lunar Wolves and then changing to the Sons of Horus is intact, although in this, it's because of the 5 legions at Horus's command. They were his Praetorians and bodyguard. The Black Legion section also includes the story of the Legion Wars in the Eye of of terror that destroyed the old Sons of Horus and caused the formation of the Black Legion. This stuff wouldn't really come up again until Aaron Dembski-Bowden started using it as the basis for his Black Legion series. The story also includes quite a bit about the importance of Titan legions to the campaign, which is no surprise, as the third book of 1988, to include details of the Heresy, is the rulebook for the first edition of Adeptus Titanicus, released in December with an accompanying competition in White Dwarf 108. The story portrayed here is a cut-down version of the one in Realms of Chaos. It even tells you to refer to Realms of Chaos for more information. It's often said that one of the main reasons for setting Adeptus Titanicus in the Horus Heresy was that the box could only really afford to contain one Titan sprue supplied in red and blue plastic, and a civil war's a really good excuse for the two sides being basically identical. But since this was all happening at once, it's kind of hard to believe that was an isolated decision. Was it just the manufacturing requirements of that one game that pushed the designers towards inventing the Heresy a year ahead of time, or did the retrofitting of Chaos to the 40k setting just handily provide a useful excuse for the game designers?
I think it's useful.
Maybe a bit of both. Either way, by the end of 1988, Warhammer 40k was a step closer to being the science fantasy setting we know, and the Horus Heresy was established as a pretty important conflict. So things continue through 1989. Now the setting's established, various marine-based White Dwarf articles could add more. For example, this article on Traitor Terminators from August 89.
Alright, I'll be back in a second. I have something that must be destroyed. Sorry about that. I had a fly that simply... I could not, deal with the buzzing in my ear. Every once in a while one gets in here and... they seem to be juiced up on something because they don't die easy. In any case, here we go.
Mentions that the Emperor teleported onto Horus's war barge, not his bunker. The next big update is with the release of the counterpart to Adeptus Titanicus, the first edition of Space Marine. Like Titanicus, this only featured one sort of sprue, Space Marines, and it was also set in the Heresy. But while the basic Heresy story in the rulebook is the same, we get a few more details in all the colour text, from the flight of the Eisenstein being planned by Tarvitz, Scarrow and Varan, to Robert Guillermin fighting against Wordbearers. 1990s Lost in the Damned fills in the other half of the Heresy lore. And in this we learn of the Emperor, the Age of Strife and the Great Crusade, and we have the first mention of the Primarchs and how their genetic material was used to create the first Marine chapters. Horus is now the greatest and most trusted of all the Primarchs. And while the actual campaign of the Heresy is skipped over, we get a bit of development on the siege and the final battle, which now takes place on Horus's mutated battle barge. We also get this classic piece by Adrian Smith, which kind of defined the Horus Heresy for most of the coming decade. So by the start of 2nd edition, all the bones of the Horus Heresy are there. The 2nd edition Codex Imperialis book, the background book included in the box set, gives us the full table of the 20 original chapters and their Primarchs, and
Yay.
reprints the basic details of the story, but it's the various codices of the 90s that really expand it. The Ultramarines Codex in 1992 reprints the story but adds in the first mentions of Space Marine legions and the story of the Codex Astartes and how the legions were split down into successor chapters. The Angels of Death Codex reprints this information and then adds to the story for Dark Angels and Blood Angels. Here we find out about Sanguinius's role in the Heresy and the Black Rage. He was always killed by Horus, but it's fleshed out a lot more here. We also get the story of the Lion and Luther and the Fallen. Again, Lionel Johnson had been mentioned before in Rogue Trader, but not as a Primarch. And the story of what happened with the Dark Angels and the Heresy is all new. There's a similar setup in Codex Space Wolves and a few bits in Codex Imperial Guard, but the real treasure trove of new fluff is the 96 Chaos Codex, which contains a much more complete retelling of the story, and then details on all 9 traitor legions, a lot of them for the first time. It's here we learn about how Lorgar turns to Chaos before the Heresy, though he isn't responsible for it yet, or how the Death Guard found Nurgle while marooned in the warp. Also in this period, we get the Horus Heresy board game, released in 1993, an Avalon Hill-style stacking war game, released as part of Games Workshop's War Game series. The fluff within is largely the same as the Rogue Trader era, but it's the first time we get a proper map of the Imperial Palace, and we can see where Lion's Gate or Eternity Gate actually are. It's accompanied in White Dwarf 161 by the minigame War Master, where you get to play out the final battle on Horus's battle barge. So at the end of 2nd edition, the greater story of the Heresy is largely the same as it was, but now it's been supplemented by all these tales of what the individual Primarchs and Legions did. So we've got the Space Wolves raising Prospero, the Iron Warriors assaulting Talan, and many of the key characters have been introduced, like Khan, Abaddon, and Ahriman. 3rd edition had famously fluff-like codices, and they don't really add anything to this, but to make up for it, we get the Index Astartes series in White Dwarf, which, as well as doing a load of articles on general aspects of Space Marine forces, focused on individual chapters or legions and added loads of detail. Generally, each article gives the Primarch origin story and reprints the basics of what we know from the 2nd edition codices, often with a little more detail, and then has a load of little box outs and asides about particular events, especially the Traitor Legion ones. In the Emperor's Children article, we get the cleansing of Lairan and Commander Eidolon. From the Iron Warriors one, we get the story of how Perturabos supervised the siege of the palace and the story of the Iron Cage. However, towards the end of this series, 2003, 2004, there's a much bigger change in how the Heresy is seen. Up until this point, it's been presented as a handy time period for interesting
Now look at that face. Look at the head of Horus in this. Seriously.
backstory. But it's about this time Games Workshop seemed to realise its potential as an actual setting. The first sign of this is the release of the Horus Heresy collectible card game in 2003, produced by Sabertooth Games, who had already released a 40k CCG in 2001. Of course, card games require a lot of art, and the Heresy at this point didn't really have any, so a stable of artists were commissioned to work on the project, and the 15 years of backstory was mined for characters and unit names.
See, I mostly got into 40k during about this time period. This is when I really started getting into it. This is when I had time to actually sit down and read books and things like that. And about this time was when I started collecting. God, I wish that would be a perfect shelf for an army. But anyhow.
This new artwork was then released by Games Workshop as Visions of Heresy, written by Alan Merritt. 4 art books released between 2004 and 2006, which tell a chronological story of the entire Heresy. This is the first time all those existing snippets and stories are put into something like a cohesive narrative. And it's also the first time the original base story is expanded. Loads is added to make it all make sense and hang together, including the Webway project, which gives us a reason for why the Emperor leaves Horus in charge in the first place, and the reason why he doesn't fight in the siege until the very end. These books also expand on Heresy-specific forces. The Mechanicum, Dark Mechanicum, and the Adeptus Custodes were often footnotes, but these books reimagine them into ancient and archaic forces. The Sisters of Silence are introduced here, based on some older John Blanche art. Also, it's in these books that Adrian Smith updates his original image of the final confrontation to this. These books have been re-released a few times since, as the colossal Collected Visions in 2007, and again as Visions of Heresy, but this time with updated cover art to make it fit in with the Black Library series in 2017. If you really want to know where the modern Heresy comes from, it's this. But it's still very much a blueprint. It makes the story hang together, but it's still written in this semi-mythological style. What came next was detail. Black Library...
You see, that's... Oh, God. Okay, so basically, that's the way that... This fucking fly, I'm going to... Where's Perturabo when I need him?
Re-released Horus Rising by Dan Abnett in 2006, and the Horus Heresy series it spawned continued through to 2019, taking in 54 main novels with countless anthologies, novellas, and short stories. And arguably, it's still continuing. I'm not going to try and summarize all of them in this video, but suffice to say they mainly add important stuff like character development and detailed plot. Some of them were amazing, some of them were terrible, but they were all extremely popular. So, like many Black Library concepts, it was only a matter of time before this all found its way onto the table. Forge World released Horus Heresy Betrayal in October 2012, when the novel series was already 23 books in, and it's presented as an expansion to the main 40k game using the same rules but with different army lists and missions. Betrayal covered the culling of the legions on Isfahan 3, and as the series continued, it expanded to cover most of those major points again. The Dropsite Massacre, the Broken Legions, the burning of Prospero. And rather than a novelization, these are told in the format of a recent historical account, which means they can take a slightly wider view than the novels. Both the Black Library and the Forge World series are ongoing series. Over the last decade, they've added way too much to go into here. Sometimes converging on the same story, sometimes focusing on totally different sections of it, and there's been some osmosis between them. I'm not sure the Horus Heresy series ever really was just one little paragraph of text. Even in 1988, it seemed too big an addition to be as throwaway or accidental as it's sometimes claimed. But its inclusion took the whole 40k setting in a totally different direction, and I'm not sure anyone from back then would have envisaged what it became. I've really enjoyed both the Black Legion and the Forge World series, but both are reaching the end of the story. Far from a mythology, it's now one of the most detailed parts of the setting, and it'll be interesting to see what happens to the Heresy once they're over. So yeah, that's how we got from this to that. I want to go into the Horus Heresy in a bit more detail in other videos, particularly about things like the art direction, which I think is really interesting. But for this video, I'll stop there. Thanks for watching.
Okay, so I really enjoyed that video. It details some things that I just didn't know. I love watching stuff like this where there's details that I simply have no clue about. This was a great recommendation. It's something like this. If you guys know something else like this, please, I love to hear about this kind of stuff. More like the real world history of how these things evolved. When I got, in the late 90s, when I started getting interested in 40k, I just thought it was cool, basically it was introduction to StarCraft, and hey, this is what this is based off of. And I thought it was cool to read a couple of novels, things like that, but it was really in 2003, so I knew about the Horus Heresy, back when, it was really just starting to come out. But I didn't know about this kind of development. I knew it had to come from somewhere, but I didn't know about how it was developed like this. In any case, I'm going to put his information down below as well as my own. My Patreon will be down in the description down below as well as the link to the Discord. And I will catch you guys next time.